Just a note before we get started. This episode contains discussions of child abuse, domestic violence, mental illness and murder. Listener discretion is advised. It was a warm spring day when two young boys were playing at Mandurama Reserve in the Sydney southwest suburb of Ambarvale. It was a place where families and friends could have a picnic or cycle around on the bike paths. But something caught the eye of these two young boys on this particular day in October. There was what looked to be a suitcase floating near the edge of a nearby duck pond. They weren't the first to spot it. There had been sightings a few days before, but no one had taken much notice. It was these boys, though, that decided to retrieve it and see what was inside. The suitcase contained the heavily decomposed remains of a toddler who, as of yet, no one even knew was missing. I'm Jessie Stevens and this is True Crime Conversations, looking into the world's most notorious crimes by speaking to the people who know the most about them. In this episode, I'm speaking with Dr. Xanthe Mallett about the case of Rachel Pfitzner, who was found guilty of the murder of her 2-year-old son, Dean Shillingsworth. Xanthe is a forensic anthropologist and criminologist who is internationally renowned for her work. She has written about and researched the case of Rachel Pfitzner, profiled in depth for her book and TV series, Mothers Who Murder. On October 17, 2007, two schoolboys were playing at a reserve in Campbelltown when they came across something a little bit unusual. What did they find?
Well, they actually found a suitcase that was in the water and it had been there for around 10 days at this point, and they kind of pulled it into the side, and when they opened it, sadly, the suitcase contained the body of a 2-year-old boy.
And so once they alerted police and the police were able to inspect what had been found, were they able to identify the person that was in there straight away?
Not initially. There were some problems with the identification because decomposition was pretty advanced. They struggled to age the deceased toddler very quickly. So it took a few days for them to kind of narrow down the age, the accurate age of the individual. And because no report had been made of a missing person of around that age, it took them a little while to figure out who he was. So it was a few days, in fact, before they formally identified him.
Let's rewind to about 7 years before, when a 19-year-old woman named Rachel Pfitzner has her first child named Miranda. What do we know about what kind of mother Rachel was in those early days?
Well, she was not a particularly stable mother, I would say. There were a number of at-risk reports made for that child. The home life was considered unstable. There were all sorts of alcohol issues and drug issues. So she was definitely struggling as a young mum when she had her first child, about 7 years before Dean's birth.
And what sort of upbringing had Rachel herself had? Do we know much about that?
Well, we do know a little bit about it. It seems reasonably stable, except she does make allegations of assault against her father having assaulted her, although I'm not aware if that was ever fully substantiated. But certainly there was some unhappiness in the household. She ended up moving out of home quite young. So there was some sort of breakdown between the relationship between her and her family. So she was always quite a transient young person, moving between family members in different hostels, and she certainly suffered at school too. She struggled to make friends, and those that she did make tended to sometimes even physically abuse her, but she felt that at least they were her friends, so she tended to tolerate this abusive behaviour because it was the only thing that she seemed to know.
And a few years later, she meets a man named Paul Shillingsworth. What was he like, and what do we know about their relationship?
Well, when they first met, he was actually in prison and she was living temporarily with his mother, Anne Coffey. So she'd found housing with Anne, and then when Paul had got out of prison, he came and lived there as well, and that's when they started a relationship. And again, this was a very tempestuous relationship. It was violent. There were allegations on both sides that there was drugs and alcohol involved. And certainly Anne early on was uncomfortable with the relationship because of the domestic violence that was mutual within this relationship. And so when Rachel got pregnant with Dean, she was particularly disturbed because you've obviously got an already unstable, violent relationship to which you're bringing in another child. So this was a big concern, and there are a number more reports to docs about at risk to Dean, even in those early stages. Even before he was born, there were reports made that he may not be in a safe environment.
And what happened to Paul once Dean was born?
Paul was still in and out of prison. So again, their relationship was always pretty stormy. There were a number of incidents they were involved together. They assaulted an individual, for example. So Paul was in and out of prison, but eventually their relationship broke down completely when Paul went back to prison for that assault. And so they separated when Dean was a few months old.
And other than that assault, what was Paul in prison for? Like, what were the sorts of crimes that he was committing?
Oh, numerous things. So Paul appears to have been a pretty good kid until he got involved with alcohol at quite a young age. Anne Coffey, his mum, is a wonderful woman, and she did her best to kind of keep him on the straight and narrow, but he got involved with the wrong crowd and then got involved with alcohol. So various violent offences were on Paul's record. So reasonably small things, but kind of in and out of prison over a protracted period.
So in 2006, and this is about a year or so after Dean had been born, Rachel sought assistance for drug, alcohol and sort of anger management issues. What do we know about her behaviour at the time?
Well, she certainly, when she started those programs, she certainly seemed committed to actually changing her lifestyle. So she was trying to make the most of those programs and to change and build a better relationship with her oldest child, and also regain full custody of Dean, who had been handed over to Anne Coffey and her partner at this point. So she was trying, but you've got to remember Rachel is a very damaged individual. So she's trying to cope with everything, but she is emotionally unstable. She does have a low IQ, and she's gonna struggle then to really process everything. And she's had a lot of problems with drug and alcohol and violent temper for a long time. So she is doing her best at that point, but she's definitely still struggling to cope and get on top of everything.
At this stage, she's sort of a single mother. How is she supporting her family? I can imagine that would have been very difficult.
It was very difficult, and social services were trying to help with that at that stage as well, with housing, get her somewhere stable and get the family somewhere stable. But even though docs seemed to aware of all of these risk, of harm reports, they never really did a comprehensive analysis of what was going on within the family. So they were giving her some assistance, but again, the family's lifestyle was pretty transitory. They were moving around between different housing, so it was all very unstable, and this was not helping Rachel kind of complete her programs because there was really nothing in her life to stabilize around.
I'm interested too in the difference between Miranda and then Dean, because there was something sort of specific about Dean that Rachel seemed to struggle with so much.
Yes. That was all to do with Dean's father. So there were issues with Miranda, the eldest child, in that, the home life wasn't particularly stable and there was various issues going on. But really when Dean came along, he reminded Rachel so much of Paul that every time she looked at him, that's all she could see. And by this point, the relationship between Paul and Rachel was very toxic. So struggling to cope with everything, he was just such a strong reminder of his father that she really couldn't cope with that at all. So he really became the focus of her anger and resentment towards Paul.
And about 4 months before a body is found inside a suitcase in Campbelltown, 26, I think she's about 26 at this stage, Rachel moves into a public housing estate with, at this point, 3 children. So she's had another child to, I believe, another father. What sorts of things did the neighbours witness?
So this was a pretty sad state at this stage. So yeah, she's in stable housing now, and actually her partner, who is the father of the 3rd child, has moved in with them. So they've been given community housing. But the neighbours were aware quite early on of the treatment of Dean. So what we would call child maltreatment, and this would be the neglect side. So we know that she was hitting him, so that would be physical abuse, but she was also neglecting him in terms of shutting him outside when it was cold, and he would be heard banging on the door asking to come in. And we know that she wasn't feeding him enough because he was always asking for food and trying to steal food. So there was various forms of maltreatment going on at this point that the neighbours were aware of, because they heard his cries, and they knew that he was stuck outside, and they knew that he wasn't being dressed appropriately for the weather, and all of those key signs that a child is being maltreated. So there were quite a few people in the community who knew what was going on.
Did they contact docs at all?
I'm not sure if the neighbours did. I mean, this is back in 2007 where, people tended not to discuss these things. They didn't want to interfere. What went on in a home was seen as kind of private. But certainly Anne Coffey, Dean's grandmother, was talking to docs and was in the process of trying to get Dean formally taken back into her permanent custody, and restriction of the biological parents seeing Dean until they had proper management of their alcohol and drugs and that they were clean, so urine tests, and also there was no violence. So Anne was certainly pushing at this point for docs to intervene, but I'm not aware that the neighbours were really taking on that kind of responsibility themselves. But certainly evidence came out later that they did know that Dean was being seriously maltreated at that time.
And for listeners who might not know a whole lot about how docs works, I mean, I would think as an outsider that a child who isn't being fed properly and is being disciplined in a way that is, physical assault, that would be quite urgent. Why was docs not sort of as present as in retrospect we think they should have been?
Oh, I would love to be able to give you a kind of this is why this happened answer, but it was just a catalogue of failings on Doc's part, to the point where there was a major inquiry at the end, because there were so many opportunities for docs to undertake a full review, a proper risk assessment. When reports were being made, nothing was being followed up because of competing priorities, as was written on the file. So it was just a catalogue of errors, people going on holiday, not following up, nobody kind of taking the file over. So Dean was basically left at Rachel's mercy, and Rachel was actually asking for help too, but docs completely let this family down, and that was certainly one of the outcomes from the inquiry, that they had really failed in this case to uphold their duties.
And the thing that's interesting too is that Anne Coffey, the mother of Paul Shillingsworth, really wanted Dean. Why was Rachel, who was clearly struggling, why was she reluctant to let Anne care for Dean?
That's a great question. Anne definitely wanted Dean. She was totally committed to taking him. She knew that he was in a terrible situation. When he was at her house and Rachel came around to collect him, he'd actually hide in the cupboard. He was really scared of his mum, and Anne was desperate to protect Dean. And for some reason, Rachel didn't want him. She was calling Doc saying, I want somebody to take this child. I can't cope with him anymore, but couldn't give him up at the same time. So I think she was in a really conflicted position where she wanted to mother Dean, but because she was so damaged and so vulnerable and so unstable emotionally and psychologically, she just couldn't cope with him at the same time. So she had this kind of ongoing conflict internally where she really wanted to care for him, but couldn't bear to look at him. And so I think she was really struggling with that. And I think the fact that he was about to formally be taken back to live with Anne was what pushed her over that day. She was waiting for that conclusion to occur, and she just couldn't cope with losing him and literally lost it in a moment of rage.
And we were talking earlier about docs, and workers actually came to the home and witnessed Rachel's relationship with her children. What did they see? What did they report?
Well, they certainly noticed that, things were strained, but they seemed to not realise the seriousness of what was going on. And they weren't following things up either. So, she'd be calling saying, somebody needs to take this child away, I can't cope with him. And then nobody was following up on that. So they were witnessing some of the abuse, but they seemed to think it was quite low level. But Rachel was also kind of hiding some of it as well. So she wasn't being totally open with them about how much she was struggling, but certainly the signs were there, and professionals from DOC should have been able to see that Dean was in danger and needed an immediate intervention to protect him.
Mm. And so on the 11th of October 2007, was he actually meant to be with Anne? Was that the day that sort of he was meant to go into the care of his paternal grandmother?
He was already in her formal care,
Yeah.
but he'd been on an unsupervised visit with Rachel, and she hadn't returned him. So Anne had been for a few days before that, she had been trying to get social services and the police to find Dean to get him back into her custody because she was his legal guardian. But she was also going through the courts to formalise that process and actually take permanent custody of Dean. And on that day, that was the process that was taking place. So Rachel would have been waiting, in essence, for the police to come around and take Dean off her, and that would have been a permanent situation. And I think that was her trigger. She desperately needed someone to take him, and I think she knew that, but she also couldn't let him go. And it was that moment of psychological and emotional distress on that day that really pushed her over. But Dean should not have been with her. Doc should have moved more quickly, and he should have been in Anne's care, which is the heartbreaking thing.
Can you talk us through what actually happened that day?
Well, yeah, that day she seems to have been pretty stressed. She was waiting for the call from the court to say that they were coming to get Dean. And apparently he was being quite clingy and quite needy. And this is normal in children who aren't getting any kind of emotional feedback from their carers. They do get quite clingy. And she found that really irritating in Dean, but she didn't understand that it was a natural response to her maltreatment, emotional abuse of him. So basically, he was being kind of what she would have classed as needy, and she just lost control for a minute and she just shook him. We believe that he had a seizure. So this was in the moment. I don't think it was any kind of premeditated act, but she shook him until he started convulsing. And then he was on the floor, and at that point she felt his chest and his heart was beating really fast, and then it stopped. And she thought at that point that she'd killed him and panicked. And so she put him in a bag, and then she put him in a suitcase, and she then put the suitcase on a pushchair, went down to the reserve and put him in the water.
Knowing what we do now, is the consensus that he probably had died, or do you think that there was hope?
Well, I actually think he was still alive at that point because he suffocated. So she put a plastic bag over his head, and I think that was probably what killed him. But I think she already believed that he was deceased at that stage. Had she thought that there was hope, I believe she may have called an ambulance because it wasn't premeditated. And I think she would have realised what had happened and that he could still be saved. But yes, he actually suffocated. So probably when she put the bags on him and put him in the suitcase, he was actually sadly still alive.
It was 6 days, or I think it was 6 days, between when that occurred and then when the body was found in the lake. Where did Rachel say he was? Why wasn't anyone looking for him by the time that body showed up?
Well, there was a lot of confusion around that time exactly where he was. So the police had gone round to the house, but she wasn't there. So they were kind of looking for Dean, but nobody except Anne was kind of panicking at the stage. So she was just waiting basically for somebody to come round and figure out what had happened. So I think she was living on a bit of a knife edge, and everyone else was acting pretty slowly. The court was going to give custody to Anne, so all of that process was working its way through, but really it was just a case of the services getting their act together and actually coming to look for Dean, and that took a few days.
And when Rachel did go to court, because they obviously realised that he couldn't be located, was it actually her that confessed, or did police just put it together?
Well, I think it was kind of a bit of both. I think when the police did realise that she wasn't with Rachel as he should have been, or as they expected when they caught up with her, and they began to talk to her about it. She did confess to what had happened because I think there was relief on her part. This is a burden she'd been carrying for a number of days. She knew that somebody was going to find out eventually. And I think she was just almost relieved to get that off her chest, what had happened. And then she did a full reenactment with police, walking them through it. She explained to them exactly what happened, where it happened, and where she'd left her body. So I think it was almost cathartic for her at that stage to actually confess to what had happened.
And when she was in court and on trial, how did she explain what happened and what her motive actually was?
Well, she pled guilty. So all she's ever said was really she kind of just lost control. All she could see at that moment was Paul, and the stress just was overwhelming, and I think she just literally had a moment of rage, and that was the only explanation the court could come up with. She just shook him and lost control, and he was young and he was vulnerable, and his little body couldn't cope with that level of trauma. So she was obviously deeply regretful of what happened. But yeah, she just wasn't emotionally stable enough to cope with the situation. And if she'd had the support she needed, and if docs had done their jobs properly, I fully believe Dean would still be with us today.
And what was Rachel eventually sentenced to?
She got, I think it was 26 years, over 26 years. So she has, it was full life sentence, minimum of 26 years. So she won't get out until she's about 48 years old. Obviously, her 2 children are now, the other surviving children are with family. And she's in Silverwater Correction Facility where she'll stay. And she seems to be doing okay there. She has routines. She has her job that she does. And I think for Rachel, that stability, that routine is really good. And she's actually, psychologically and emotionally doing quite well. And I think that awful situation to have happened, but I think she is somebody that can be helped, can be rehabilitated, because there was nothing premeditated in what she did. She just needed emotional and psychological support to cope with her life.
And what do you think can actually be learned from this case, especially when it comes to the role of docs, who I think are now actually referred to as FACS?
Family and Community Services.
Yeah. What do you think that we can learn looking back on it?
Well, there were so many points at which at risk of harm reports were made and not followed up, not taken seriously. It was a long time before anyone actually had face-to-face contact with either Rachel or any of the children. So certainly there have been procedures put in place to triage cases better, to manage cases better, and to note when children are at serious risk of harm. So things have improved, but the name is, as you mentioned, has changed to Family and Community Services from what it was as docs. And so we are seeing changes, but children do still end up being harmed. So we will never have a perfect system, but I'm hopeful after the review into this case that this many systemic failures could never happen again.
Yeah, I think there is, there are cases that you look at where, either it's a freak accident or you just look at someone who appears to be a total monster. But in this, as you say, there does seem to be some real social learnings from it that you look back and go, it could have been prevented at this point. And the fact that there were people who wanted to look after this child, I think that's almost the most tragic part, that he could have had such a lovely life with that paternal grandmother who loved him, and instead he was left with a mother who was struggling.
Yeah, and I think that was what was most heartbreaking. I spent a number of days with Anne Coffey and her partner, and she is like Mother Earth. The kids just kind of gravitate to her, and that was a few years after they lost Dean. But you could still see the trauma. They will never get over losing Dean. They speak about him in the present tense, and the home is like a shrine to him. And it is so tragic that child was so deeply loved that he didn't have to be in that awful situation. And Rachel did something terrible. There's no excusing that. But I do feel for a young woman that was struggling so badly and no one was helping her. And she was desperately asking for help. And I just think the whole situation is so tragic. And I really hope we never see anything like this happen ever again.
Thank you so much for your time today. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.
You can find Xanthe Mallett's book and documentary series, Mothers Who Murder, online, or by following the link in the description of this episode. For photos, maps, and extra reading on this case, don't forget to join our closed Facebook group. Just search True Crime Conversations on Facebook. You can also contact the show by emailing truecrime@mamamia.com.au. True Crime Conversations is a Mamamia podcast hosted by me, Jessie Stevens, and produced by Elise Cooper.